The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, which is the Management and Administration High-Level Core Component Assessment webinar. So can I just check if there's that everyone can sort of see the screen and they can hear me all right? If you can just pop it in the chat just to let me know, and at least that way I know I'm not talking to myself. Thank you. So as normal, a couple of platform guidelines first of all. So all attendees are in listen-only mode, but please do type any questions in the question box and we will try and answer them as we go along in the question box, or we'll come to them at the end. We are delivering this webinar from home and we are in separate locations. So please bear with us in case of any technical hitches, time lags in the slides or the usual background noises. We've allowed an hour today for the webinar as there is a lot of information we'll be sharing with you. If we do experience any serious technical hitches, we are recording the webinar anyway, but we would end the webinar and then we will record it at a later date. And of course, as normal, the recording and the slides will then be sent out to each of you along with a CPD certificate once we collate all your details. So the main purpose of this webinar is to provide a high-level overview of the core assessments of the T-level technical qualification. So this webinar is aimed at centres who have started delivering in September, this September sort of gone. So it is in delivery centres this is aimed at. So as T-levels are brand new and the technical qualification within the T-level is vastly different to any other VRQ, MVQ type qualifications. And of course, one of the biggest changes will be teaching to a syllabus which have end exams, just as there are in A-levels and GCSEs. So we will be providing a lot of information, which we've broken down into digestible chunks. The session is more about ensuring centres and delivery teams understand the core assessment principles and practices. Now, there will be a more detailed session on core assessments prior to your first theory exam series in May and June, when we will provide more detail of what evidence you'll need and a further recap on the strategies beforehand. So just moving on now. Before we start, I'm sure you know some of us by now, but in case of any new attendees, these are the people supporting you for the Management and Administration T-level. My name is Alison Whittle. I'm the Post-16 Technical Advisor at City and Guilds, and I'm joined today by Dom Green, the Technical Advisor for Business, and Karen Egan, the Technical Advisor for Leadership and Management at City and Guilds and ILM. So today, what we're going to be looking at is, the high-level overview of the core assessments, some detail of the assessment objectives and how they relate to the question types. We're going to look at an overview of the command verbs, some question types using some of the sample assessments to give you some sort of ways of answering those types of questions and hints and tips for your learners. I've got links to all of the teaching and learning guides and the support resources. So what we won't be able to talk about today is any occupational specialism assessments, any curriculum planning outside of the TQ, progression or industry placements, or we won't be providing a detailed breakdown of all assessments today, because the session will be followed up with an in-depth breakdown of both theory and the ESP prior to your first delivery. So I've tried to approach this webinar from your perspective, really, and start with some of the usual questions that I would want to know the answers to, and to make sure that, what is being covered is going to be relevant to you. So, for example, I would want to know how many assessments are there? What do they look like? What's being assessed? How's it being assessed? and also really what's not being assessed. When do you need to start preparing your learners for these assessments? What resources are available to me? How the core assessments are marked and graded, and when do the learners take these assessments? So that's what we'll be answering today as we go along the webinar. So in answer to one of the questions before, I've included the timelines here for your first core assessments in 2023. Beginning in April. So what will happen is the employer set project, which is referred to as the ESP, the materials will be released to you as a centre on the 27th of March. Your delivery window will start from your assessment window for this will be the 3rd of April to the 12th of May. There is a 6-week window for the ESP rather than a 4-week window to allow for the Easter break. On the 12th of May, that is the deadline that you have to upload the evidence for. The exam is in 2 parts, so it's 1 exam in 2 papers. And the first paper 1 is sat on the 6th of June, which is 2.5 hours long, followed by a second paper on the 13th of June, which again is 2.5 hours long. And they are your exam dates for this year. So I'm going to provide a high-level overview now of the core exams. So for the core assessments, learners must complete 2 externally set and externally marked exam papers. And these cover the knowledge from the management and admin core. And they have to complete an employer set project, which is the ESP, which also covers knowledge and skills from the management and administration core. Now, all of these assessments are provided by City and Guilds and marked by City and Guilds. So in other words, we provide them and mark everything. There is no marking to be carried out by the centre for any of the core exams. Now, each of the papers, as I mentioned before, are 2.5 hours long each and have 100 marks for each paper. They are weighted at 30% for each paper, so the exams are 60% of the total core, and the employer set project is 25 hours in duration. That has 100 marks. The weighting of that is 40%, again, externally set and externally marked. It's based on a series of 6 tasks, which I'll be going into as we go through the webinar. And this is graded on a scale of A star to E, which is the same grading scale used for general qualifications. So I've just isolated this little bit here because I've isolated the core assessments from the occupational specialisms, as today is purely around the core assessments. So as we mentioned before, the theory exams are equally weighted at 30% and the ESP is weighted at 40%. The exams are marked against a uniform mark scale before any grade boundaries have been set together with the ESP. Then they are aggregated to provide an overall grade for the core component. And I said that is obviously, as we said before, that is A star to E. So this is the focus of today's webinar. So looking at some of the detail in the exam papers. So each exam is in 2 parts. So part A has 55 marks in total, which will remain the same for each series. And those 55 marks are typically made up of 17 short and medium type answer questions. Now that means that they have a low and medium tariff marks, usually sort of questions that carry marks between 1 and 4 marks. And this is weighted to 55% of the exam marks, obviously, because it's out of 100. Now part B has 45 marks and includes 4 extended response questions, and that's weighted at 45% of the exam. Now, both core papers will follow the same structure, but each core paper will cover different technical content. So at the bottom of the page, you can see here the focus and the content that is in each of the papers. Now, what is important here to understand is that both these exams are profiled. In other words, the level of difficulty will increase through the paper, with the easier, lower demand questions at the beginning of the paper to the higher demand, higher tariff mark questions towards the end of the paper. Now, that really is to sort of, so students can sort of learners can gain the confidence in answering the questions, to sort of begin them, to give them some confidence there. So in section A, the questions will begin with demonstration of recall and understanding, and that will have assessment objectives next to it. So on the next couple of slides, we'll be looking at, and it's really to settle a settling start to the assessment. And then the papers will broadly build in demand, with more sort of demonstration of application of knowledge and skills, down to the hierarchy skills of evaluation, justification and analysis. So the content that is covered in paper 1 is business context, people and business behaviours. And in paper 2, the content covered is quality and compliance, finance principles, policies and procedures, and project and change management. Now, the bracketed numbers that you can see at the side of those topics there relate to each of the 7 topics in the core, which is shown in the qualification handbook. So, for instance, you know, core 1, module 1, or sort of assessment knowledge outcome 1 is business context 2. So at least you've got the whole of those sort of to know exactly what paper and what context is going to be assessed within those exams. So the weighting and the marks are going to stay exactly the same for every exam series. So, for example, in section B of the papers, there is always going to be 4 extended response questions. So as I showed you earlier, you know, the exam paper 2 is released approximately 1 week after the exam paper 1 to allow you time to prepare for that. So this next section focuses on the theory exam, those 2 papers on the overall theory exam, and the use of those command verbs in the question papers. Now, there's a huge amount of information in here, so I'm just going to break this down really. So just to give you an idea, there are only 3 assessment objectives that are used in the core theory exams. And the assessment objectives, these have all been developed by Ofqual and the Institute IFATE across all of the TQ, technical qualification core assessments. So you can see here we've got AO1, AO2 and AO3. And AO1 is broken down further to AO1A and AO1B. Now, understanding these assessment objectives really is key to the theory exam. And to highlight this further, the verb often relates to the skill demand, which then relates to the number of marks. So, for example, the state type questions will be worth the lower end of the mark tariff, as they only assess recall of knowledge, whereas the larger marks are at the end of the paper, and they're going to sort of tackle the ability to analyse, evaluate, and will use command verbs such as justify, evaluate, and discuss. So, as I explained earlier, both of these papers are profiled against these assessment objectives. So that means in theory, or in practice, sorry, they will get all the AO1 questions first, followed by the AO2, and then they're going to finish on the questions starting with AO3, which are the higher mark questions. So in this particular slide, the first column I've got is the meaning of the assessment objective. So AO1 is about demonstrating knowledge. AO1B is about demonstrating understanding. Then we look at AO2, which is apply knowledge to the context of different situations. And then we've got AO3, analyse and evaluate. So what we look at here is the weighting of this. Now, all this is in the qualification handbook. So, you know, it is all there for you, but we're going to unpick it a little bit more in the next few slides. So just to summarize this slide, the core theory exams are marked and weighted against these assessment objectives, and the allocation remains the same for all versions of the assessment to ensure consistency. So straight away you can see that AO2 has the highest weighting, followed by AO3, then AO1, AO1A and 1B is 30% between them, 10 for the shorter type recall questions and 20% looking for demonstrating knowledge. Also hugely important is that the general competencies of maths, English and digital skills will be assessed where appropriate within the core component. So I'm just going to sort of break this down further. You know, we refer to command verbs. So, you know, just so what are they? So they are the words and phrases that we use in all exams and assessment tasks, and they are to tell the learners how they should respond to the question. And it's so important that learners are trained to recognise and respond to the different command verbs, as it tells the learners the level and depth of response the examiner is going to be looking for. So I've just put a really simple infographic there that you can use to begin with for your learners to get used to the most common command verbs and the meanings. So without spending too much time on these slides, I really wanted to give you a head start with supporting your learners in understanding and responding to the different command verbs. You know, for some learners, they may not have actually taken any exams for 2 years. So it's going to be really important to reintroduce this as early as possible, as learners, you know, may have forgotten or even lost those exam technique skills that they've previously learned in schools and colleges. So I've produced this list for you in a table format that you can use to help with the definition and meanings of each command verb and the typical assessment objectives or AOs used for each of those command verbs. So you can see here AO1A, I've listed all, and that's basic recall. So the sort of questions are going to start with identify, label, list, state, name, select, and define, etc. So they're the types of questions that they'll start with, which are going to be short answer type questions. And then we have AOB. So I've listed all the typical type of command verbs used for recall and understanding. And these two together make up 30% of the total exam. So you will get these slides obviously later. So if you look at each assessment objective will have, as I say, a different value. So if we look at short, low tariff, state, list, name, recall type questions, it's really only going to be a maximum of 1 mark with possibly a further mark for more depth of explanation. So it's 1 to 2 type mark questions. Whereas we move on to AO2, which is going to be on the next slide here. AO1 and B and AO2, you can see really that they're going to be more like the 4 mark questions, which do, you know, sort of really are looking for a higher level of response. Now, I've done the same here on this slide for assessment objectives AO2, application of knowledge, and that carries 40% of the weighting of the theory exam, which, as you'll be aware, is what is the highest weighting. And the final assessment objective is AO3, which has a weighting of 30%, and this will normally be associated with the extended response type of questions. And there is an example of what that looks like as we move through the webinar. So just to give you, you can use these, print them out, put them up on the walls, use those as part of your training for the learners. It's just a resource. Alongside, I've just included a very short activity as an introductory activity you can use to start your learners in practicing command verbs if you haven't already done so. And I've just included the answer guide for that here. So to give you a break from my voice now, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Dom, who is going to talk you and take you through the next section. So just to say, hand over to you, Dom.
Thanks very much, Ali, much appreciated. Okay, so we're going to talk now about, if we could just, thank you, Ali, if we could just skip through, thank you. We're just going to talk about now, try and break down the core example before I pass back to Ali to look at the employer set project in more detail. So these slides link very nicely to what Ali's just been presenting. We can clearly see then here that this is a screenshot from the sample exam, which is available on our website for any centres to download. So they're directly linked to what Alison's just been through, and you can see that question 3 states identify one way, which essentially is for 1 mark only, and quite often you can tell the depth of the response required not only by the command verbs and the amount of marks, but the number of lines also associated to the question. So this only has 2 lines. So because it's identify here, the response required is to, say, recognize a feature. It might be from a document, it might be from an image, etc. And the learner needs to state what it is. And we can see that in the mark box to the right there, some of the acceptable answers are areas such as being dependable, being honest, demonstrating strong moral principles, and showing commitment. So they are very much identifying and almost one-word answers. What's positive is that in the guidance, it also says accept any other answer that reflects integrity as an honest, moral or ethical attribute. So it's not just about the examiner looking at the responses from the learner and thinking, well, actually, they've not got any of those 4. The examiner will look above and beyond to see if they can accept any other answer that reflects the question type. And of course, like Ali said, the short answer questions with the less marks aligned to AO1A, which is 10% of the overall weighting. So you can see that in the right upper column. As we move on to question 4, sorry, if we could just go back one. As we move on to question 4, it says state 2 formal digital communications. So here, there's 2 marks for 2 formal digital communications. So an appropriate answer here. Give the relevant points briefly. So again, looking at email, intranet, video conferencing and software. And again, the marker is looking at accepting alternative answers. And again, it's linking back to the 10% weighting AO1A. So the key words there in question 4 is integrity, formal digital communications. And I suppose really here it's about making sure the learner can break down the question, even at such a low mark, even as a question with such low marks, it's about making sure that the learner is identifying what's required. So state is give the relevance points briefly, but specifically around integrity and formal digital communications. Thanks, Ali. So as we move through, we can see that we're now moving on to question 10, and this is relating to AO1B, which is 20% weighting of the overall grade. And it's asking for 2 ways that staff development benefits an organisation, and a total of 4 marks in total. So you can see the acceptable answers on the left-hand side and the guidance in the middle, along with the number of marks associated. So we need to make sure that the learner is understanding the difference between identify, state, and explain. So although it's only 2 ways, we do need the learner to go into a little bit more detail in order to get the full marks. Thanks, Ali. So what we've done here is break down question 20, which is for 12 marks. So we have, so the question 20 then is looking to evaluate. So make an analysis about the success or the quality, for example, of say the end product or outcome. These kind of questions to evaluate are usually systematic. So the learner will potentially need to propose improvements or something like that. So as we move forward on this slide, we've broken down question 20 and highlighted the key areas. So it's a leading hotel chain. There's local and national media. They're expressing different opinions. The concern about the behaviour of the staff. So that's setting the scene. What the learner needs to understand also is that they need to evaluate the effectiveness of the different approaches and to minimize the potential impact. So those are the key areas that the learner really needs to focus on. So there's a large job really to do here to break down these questions during your mock ESPs to make sure that the learner understands where they're going to get those 12 marks from. Because at this stage, because it's evaluate, the learner needs to make an analysis. So there is guidance alongside these questions. So if we could skip forward again, Ali, please. Thank you. So we can see here that they need to examine and look at the content, first of all. They then need to show how effective their outcome is. So how successful is their evidence? What different approaches or different methods? So it's requiring more than one suggestion because it's plural. So a learner needs to understand, but just by looking at the question, there's different approaches, which is plural, and there's potential impacts as well. So there's more than one response required, or more than one, impact required, and minimize potential impacts. So how have they suggested to reduce the effect of all consequences? There is, of course, indicative content for every question that we have on the sample exam as well. So we can see here those potential impacts are outlined on the slide. It linked back to approaches. So the question 20 went through the effectiveness of different approaches. So there is a list there of the different approaches potentially a learner could list. But it also mentioned the effectiveness, the potential of effectiveness of those different approaches as well. So that in order for the learner to maximize those 12 marks, they need to look at, first of all, potential impacts, the different approaches, and then the effectiveness of those as well. So it really is back to breaking down the question and making sure that the learner understands what's required of them. So what we're going to do now is look at the band descriptors. So it's broken down into 4 particular bands. You can see the maximum marks is 12. You can see that it's assessing AO2 and AO3. What the assessor will do is allocate into the bands, allocate marks depending on where the evidence falls into the band grade descriptors. So for band 1, there's 3 marks available. For band 2, there's up to 6 marks available, 4 to 6, and band 3, 7 to 9, and band 4, 10 to 12. So depending on the level of the learner's response, they're evident that it will fall into one of those bands. So obviously, as you can understand, band 1 is the most basic, so applies basic understanding of the importance of workplace behaviour, for example, and the next step up would be a good understanding, followed by a thorough understanding, and then a comprehensive understanding, and that follows through the entire core exam. So we'll always grade against bands 1 to 4. Now, demonstrating a basic use of analysis of topics covered under EIR, for instance, is band 1. These particular band descriptors are not created by City and Guilds. They have been signed off by Ofqual, by IFATE, etc. And these are used in every T level across all subject areas. So it's not City and Guilds that use basic, good, thorough, comprehensive. they are used throughout all T levels. So we can see here then the breakdown of basic, good, thorough and comprehensive. There is some initial concern about the difference between thorough and comprehensive. So just to look at that in a little bit more detail, accurate understanding for thorough, and for comprehensive, a detailed and accurate understanding. So obviously the top marks are awarded to that comprehensive analysis. The AO3 is accurate analysis. Obviously AO3 has a more in-depth requirement to be achieved. So AO3 is looking at the detailed and accurate analysis, and AO3B, the evaluation, detailed and substantiated evaluation throughout the application. So really drilling down into that evaluation, that analysis side of things in order to get the top grades. So hopefully that will help to break down how it's graded for the learners. And I think there's a task to do there before actually they go anywhere near the sample ESP, just to make sure that they understand the requirements and of course how it's graded. Okay, so I think next is I'm passing back to Ali for the high-level overview of the employer set project.
Thanks, Dom. So let's move on. So this slide here, we're now going to look at the ESP, or the Employer Set Project. So this slide here is showing a high-level overview of all of the tasks, the timings and the marks awarded for each of the tasks of the ESP. So as I mentioned before, we are going to be providing really detailed information in either a network webinar, or a network or a webinar before the actual exam. So the Employer Set Project consists of 6 different tasks with time allocated for each task, making the total time of the ESP 25 hours. So the tasks are going to be released in order of sequence. However, for the centre, you will probably get all of the tasks at one time to allow to help with your planning. But what is important is that the tasks have to be released to the learner in order of sequence. So they can't complete a task out of order. For example, they can't do task 1.4 before they've done task 1.1 or 1.2. So the reason we release them all to you together is to help with your planning, but obviously only one task at a time for the learner. So you can see the marks that are allocated to each of these tasks. Now, what is different here is that the marks are based on the weighting and the level of skill required for the task, rather than the time. So I think the message here is it's all about the quality and the quality of the skill required rather than the time allowed. So don't associate the time with the actual marks. It's the actual task itself. So and of course, I think I put that as a little footer there. The time allocated and the allocation of marks are not related, which has come up before in questions. So you've got these 6 tasks. You've got task 1.1, which consists of 3 small tasks within that, which is one is a research, one is the outcome of a research project, and one is determine a solution. There is a product initiation document that they have to complete for 1.2. There's a project planning task for 1.3, a presentation for 1.4, a collaborative problem solving sort of with a group discussion for 2.1, and finally an evaluation document. So I'm going to be looking into some of these details here and to break this down a little bit more. So rather than read this slide out, because you can see there for yourself, I'd just rather highlight, if I can, some of the salient points. So the ESP is based on the knowledge, theories and concepts of a problem and how that learner will pull a plan together. Now, we'd probably refer to this as metacognition, which put simply, it just means the learner has to think about one's thinking. So it's about the processes that learner is using to plan, to monitor, and to assess their understanding and performance. So as we know, it's a project, and it is assessment of several tasks. Now, these tasks must take place within controlled assessments. It's not an invigilation condition, so you don't have to sit in an exam room. It can take place in the classroom with the tutor, but it is what we would call a controlled assessment. And it's only assessing the knowledge and skills taught or learned as part of the core elements of the T-level. So what happens is City and Guilds develop each of these projects together with employers in the industry, and that's to reflect realistic types of development activities and challenges. It is not connected in any way to the industry placement with employers, nor do you have to provide any evidence from any employers for this assessment. It is purely written and produced separately. It's nothing to do with the industry placement, although the word employer sometimes throws people. So you can see what it's going to be like. It's a realistic brief. And the reason the employer set project is called that is because it has been sort of signed off by our employers and industry board. So a little bit more information here. So I mentioned it only samples knowledge from across the core content. However, due to the importance of this, all versions of any employer set project is going to cover content from the following core underpinning knowledge outcomes. And these will always include business context, project and change management, and business behaviours. Now, the ESP is also assessing the 7 key core skills. Now, these are listed on page 20 of your qualification handbook, and it's all about business. I mean, I'm not going to read them all out, you can see them there. So the 7 is, you know, A to G, and this is what the whole of the ESP is going to be assessing. So it's those core skills: communication, project management, collaboration, reflective practice, in other words, evaluation and reflective reviewing, and how to undertake some research. So it's based on that, and it only looks at the core knowledge. It is not touching any of the occupational specialism at all, as they are going to be assessed separately as part of some practical assignments. What may be different to other qualifications is learners are going to be marked on the accuracy and quality of their work produced. So I'm going to sort of go into this as we move through the webinar. So back to the assessment objectives for the ESP, and as you can see, they differ significantly from the assessment objectives for the theory paper. So this table is in brief, and it just provides an explanation of each assessment objective and the typical evidence that you need to produce, or the typical evidence that the learner needs to be produced for that. So you can see straight away there that assessment objective AO2 has the highest weighting of 50%. Now that is an off-qual requirement, that 50% of the marks have to be weighted on application of knowledge and skills. And these assessment objectives and weightings are going to become so much clearer when I start to unpick how the marks are allocated against each of these AOs, and what is going to be assessed in each of the tasks, but also what's not going to be assessed in each of these tasks. So for full details of these, they're going to be on page 29 in your qualification handbook. So if we can just refer to those, I've broken these down a lot further as we move through the webinar. So on this slide, this table is showing how the 100 marks for the employer set project are distributed against each of those 6 tasks. So the assessment objectives I showed you in the previous slide have been mapped against each of those tasks, and then show the total mark for each task. So you can see here, and we're going to look at the breakdown of those. So the highest marks really are going to be 1.1, which is obviously in 3 parts, we said, which is investigate the project brief. followed by your presentation, then the project initiation document, project planning, then it's going to be evaluation carries 15 marks and 12 marks for collaborative problem solving. So that's the whole of this. So now we're going to start breaking it down bit by bit. So this is the shows how those assessment objectives have been broken down. So I'm going to be looking at the detail for each of these 6 tasks separately to help you support learners to understand what they're going to be assessed against. So the reason this has been broken down into this finite detail, really, in some, you can see here AO4 is in AO4A, AO4B and AO4C, which is about the use of maths, English and digital. So you can see AO4A is maths, AO4B is English, AO4C is digital. We've also got AO2 broken down to AO2A and AO2B. AO2A is looking at the application of core knowledge, and AO2B is the application of core skills, and it lists there. And we've also got AO5A is it's all about realizing a project outcome and about the review. So what you will see, the reason these have been broken down so much really is to help the markers interpret the assessment objectives accurately. So that's what they will be marking against. So going back now, what will happen is the learners will get an overall brief, and they must keep that with them for each task so they can keep referring to the brief. There will be 6 separate tasks, all relating to that one brief that they have to complete in sequence. So if we start off with task 1.1, and that is investigating the project brief. Now, if this is 8 hours, you have a duration to complete this task, and there are 20 marks in total. You can see here that they've got an extra 30 minutes additional reading time at the start of this task. They do have access to the internet, and the task has been split into 3 sections to support the manageability of this task over multiple sessions, because you may do 4 2-hour sessions, you may do 8 1-hour sessions. So it's allowing you to plan your assessment there, but they should be sequenced really and can occur on consecutive days. So looking at what we discussed before, you can see here how the assessment objectives are broken down. So we've got AO1, planning is only 2 marks. AO2 and AO2A and AO2B is 6 marks each, so very highly weighted on the application of knowledge and application of skills. We've got 4 marks for selecting relevant techniques and resources, and of course you can see here AO4A is used, which is the maths component of the AO4. There is no English, no digital, no evaluation or reviewing is being assessed on this particular task. So it just gives you a breakdown of how that is looked at. For this one, the next one here is the project initiation document. So you are provided and must use the City and Guilds initiation document template for this task. So again, you can see quite clearly you've got 3.5 hours to complete this task. It could be done in 1 session, it may be in 2 sessions. There is 17 marks in total. And if we look at where those 17 marks are, you can see straight away heavily weighted again on AO2A, B, AO2A and B, which is 9 marks in total, largely assessing the application of the skills and knowledge. And then they're planning, and AO3A is did they select the correct techniques and resources to meet the brief. There is no assessment of maths, English, digital or evaluation within this task. So it should be fairly straightforward as we move along. So the next task is 1.3, and that is the project planning task. So again, this is 4 hours in total, and it carries 17 marks. So those 17 marks you can see here again, 8 marks in total for AO2A and B together, followed by AO3. Again, we can see here that the English is going to be looked at in this one. I'm just going to check on that one there. It is the AO4A. You're allowed 2 marks. They're looking for the accuracy of work there. And AO1, which is planning their approach to the meeting brief. Again, there's no digital or evaluation. So what evidence do you need to give for this? So they should have access to a spreadsheet software for the completion of this project plan on a page. We're looking for a supporting statement of approximately 750 words. And this completed project plan on a page should be used by you as a tutor as part of the task for 1.4 in the presentation. And that's so you can refer to the details of the proposed solution and the candidate's plan, and it'll help inform your questioning for the next step, which is the presentation stage. So this is a huge amount of information here. So I'm going to break this right down. While I'm leaving this on there, I'm just going to sort of break this down a little bit further, really, to support you. So this is the presentation task here, and it's really where learners should be focusing their efforts to gain the most marks. You can see there are 19 marks within this, and it's heavily weighted against the English and the digital skills, obviously, for accuracy and how they use what technique, whether they use in sort of media or sort of PowerPoints to produce this. So what I'm going to do now is just share with you your responsibilities as a tutor for this task. So as a tutor, you should really play the role of the trustee for this task. I would say make sure that you have the learner's presentation slides beforehand. So you've got those slides. Just a hint, really, make sure there's a clock in the room and make sure it's visible, and that you can then inform learners of how much time they've got left, how much time they've used, etc. You must ask the same 3 questions for each learner to make sure a fairness of questioning, and guidance has been provided for you for the types of questions you need to ask, or the types of the question types. You must record the presentation, and you must keep a written copy of the questions that you've asked and the responses that you've been given. And another hint, really, is those video recordings of presentations must be in an appropriate format, and audible sound levels. Now, we are going to provide you with the format, again, with the length and the size of the recording. So you will have, you'll know exactly what sort of format we want it in and how long we want that recording for. So supporting information. So candidates should use really digital technology to present the findings. So, although they don't have to, they can use notes. It's recommended that they use PowerPoint. They have 3 hours of preparation session of this session to prepare this presentation, and that includes time for candidates to prepare and practice. And they've got 30 minutes for the questions. So I would look at this as 3 hours to prepare the whole presentation, get them to time the presentation for 15 minutes actual presenting, and allow for 15 minutes of questioning, which takes up your full 3.5 hours. I'd allow 10% tolerance if it was me, just to allow for that to go over those 15 minutes. And again, think about how many presentations you may be able to do in one session if it's 30 minutes per presentation. So you may need to be timetabling these over consecutive days, depending on the size of your cohort. So straight away, you can see that, the majority of marks here are on AO2B, which is application of core skills. English is heavily weighted for the accuracy, which is AO4B, 6 marks, followed by digital, AO4C, which is 4 marks, and application of knowledge, AO2A. So hints and tips. The earlier you can start introducing presentation skills in small groups of micro teaching, the easier it's going to be for these learners to develop those skills. So that's one hint and tip for you. Next one, we're coming on to the last but one task, which is task 2.1, which is a collaborative problem solving task, which is 2.5 hours long and 12 marks. And this task involves learners being given a brief where they must work in small groups and take part in a discussion. So on the sample ESP, learners will have to produce an advisory note and then create a message for social media. So again, learners should focus on where those marks are gained, which is application of core knowledge, AO2A, 3 marks, and application of core skills, AO2B, 6 marks, with a further 3 marks for AO1, planning skills and strategies. So looking at that one, what really is, I'm going to give you a little hint and tip with this one. I would suggest you don't do it in more than a group of 3. I would also suggest there's a microphone in the middle to capture, and I'd also suggest that those learners have a name and their candidate number with them, so every candidate is identified as taking part within this collaborative problem solving. So we've given you some evidence here. So video recordings, they should move to directly drafting their advisory note as soon as those discussions are conducted, and we've given you an approximate word count there. We're saying really, you know, the advisory note is about 300 words, and then we're asking them to provide a social media message with a maximum of 280 characters or so to reflect the requirements. So that's the collaborative task. So finally, we've got there. This is by the last task here, which is the evaluation task, which is 3.5 hours allocated in time, and it has 15 marks in total. And learners must produce an evaluation of the project. And that's approximately, we've said, about 1,000 words. Now, as you'd expect, the majority of this task is marked against AO5, which is carry out tasks and evaluate for the fitness of purpose. So you can see where the majority of those marks are. Some hints and tips for this. You know, there are many different ways you can approach it. Some learners would like to take each task separately and evaluate each task. In other words, you know, what went well, what didn't go well, what would I do differently next time? Classic evaluation sort of technique. Some learners may want to do it at the end and evaluate it at the end. But if you sort of use those sort of techniques, is what do you think went well? What didn't go well? And what would you do differently next time? You're in sort of a reasonable sort of getting those learners to get those evaluation and reflective tasks to get those higher sort of marks really on that grading there. So finally, this is it. By hopefully revisiting this slide again, it makes it clearer to you how key those assessment objectives are and how they're broken down and how the ESP, the Employer Step Project, is going to be marked against it. So that makes it a little bit more easier sort of to understand, rather than just seeing this as a complete thing. So just in my sort of in the meantime, I've included some hints and tips for exam preparation that you can start really with your learners as early as possible. You know, the infographics, get them used to those command verbs. I'd also let the learners know when the exam sessions are going to be, so you can highlight the sessions where you're going to go through exam prep. Definitely practice presentation skills, linking to those 7 core competencies that are being assessed. If there are any sort of, SWOT, PESTEL type sort of legislation and processes, mnemonics are always a good way to introduce learners for them. And I would be practicing those ESP tasks, research, note taking, drafting an email, and presentation skills, and get them used to working in groups. And I would be showing the learners what they're going to be assessed on. I would be showing them the marking grids and scoring grids, and showing them what is basic, what does good look like, and using those sample support resources. So this is my final slide, and I've included here some links to some helpful documents, and this has got all of your key dates in, links to all the resources for management and admin in case you've missed them. Everything I've talked about today is in a guide, but it's quite lengthy to read a guide. Sometimes it's good to be bring it to life a little bit. And we've also included a navigation video for you. It's only very short, and it tells you where you can find all of your resources for the management and admin there to save you sort of trawling through the website. Now, I'm going to hand back to Dom to close, but I would just like to say thank you for listening to a really heavy information session. So, we really do appreciate you sort of bearing with us for all this time. So I'm just going to hand back to Dom to close and see if we can take some questions, if that's possible. So thank you, Dom.
Thanks, Sally, much appreciated. So we have had a number of questions come through, and not to forget as well, we are conscious of time. There's a couple of minutes left before 11 o'clock. That some of you have had sound issues, but it does seem to be at your end, but not to worry. You will get a copy of the recording sent to you automatically after the webinar. So it should be by the end of the day, you should get a link to the recording so you can go back to it in your own time. We'll also post a copy of the slides up on our website as well, so you can look at the slides independently. Just to recap some of the questions that we've had, essentially areas such as the Easter holidays plays a large part in the controlled assessment window. We are aware of that. There is a 6-week period of which 25 hours needs to be fit into the 6 weeks. So it's more than doable. We are aware also that some centres will have different Easter holidays. Some will not return until the 17th of April. That's absolutely fine. That's been taken into consideration because you've still got 3 to 4 weeks, 3 weeks there, just over 3 weeks there to fit in a 25-hour window. The majority of centres are doing it in about 2 weeks, and they are splitting the 25 hours into say 12 and 13, depending on the tasks, but that's more than sufficient time. Other questions are things like, can students use Microsoft Project? Of course, you can use project software if you wish. Can you get a comfort break halfway through the tasks? You can indeed, that's absolutely fine. Just looking through them now, I have answered them the majority of them apart from the last 3 that have just come in. Just to point out before we break up, before we finish the webinar, we are having a follow-on Q&A webinar next Monday regarding this webinar. That will be on Microsoft Teams. You can register for that on our website. You register via Eventbrite, and what we will do then is send you a link to the Teams the day before, and that will be a more open forum where centres can come and ask questions to myself, Ali, Karen, etc. For further guidance. Unrelated, so a quick question from Gemma, unrelated to the session, but do you know when the occupational specialism assessment is? We're trying to plan year 2, but it just says summer 2024. It's still to be confirmed, Gemma, but it's normally around the same time as the controlled assessment window for the ESP. So this will be confirmed and we'll let you know as soon as possible, but normally about May time. Ali, is that correct for wave 2? Do you know?
Yeah. What I'll do is I'll check and I'll put this out in an email for you. I mean, we'll have them published, but because it's only obviously year 1, we tend to work a year, not quite that far ahead. So yes, it's the ESP window starts, but the occupational specialism is starting in May and June this year for wave 2. Can I just ask a quick question? What would really help while we've got people still on the call, could you just please jot down in the chat or the question box what you would like us to cover in the next webinar? Because this is all about you. It's, we really want to make sure that you're getting the support that you need. Yes, we've got contractual obligations to Ofqual and IFATE, but really we want to tailor this for you. So please put what you would like us to cover in the next one. It won't be occupational specialism, it will just be core, but what type of things that we haven't covered today or you'd like gone over or made clearer, that would really help us. Thank you.
So there's a few questions coming in all around the answer, Ali, to sample answers around the ESP and further practice tests. Now, unfortunately, we don't provide model answers for the ESP. The rationale behind that is it's very much an IFATE decision. The awarding organisation that wins the tender, there's no obligation there to provide the sample answers, and of course, because they do follow the same how they're set are all very similar throughout the assessment windows. It almost could be perceived as too supportive for learners. So unfortunately, there won't be sample assessments, sample answers for the ESP at all. So we can't support there, unfortunately. Model answers for core, yes, okay, thanks Shiva. Unfortunately, we can't provide that for ESP. ESP a bit more broken down, e.g. what is expected for CBA. Okay.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Got that, that's great.
Okay, we can address that.
Great.
Yeah.
What we can do is we can look at, I don't know how you all feel about this, but what I can do is take some of the examiner's comments of the common mistakes that were made in wave 2 during the ESP and share with you. I know they may not they're not related to management and admin, but they were common mistakes that most learners made. So I can share those with you, hints and tips on how to avoid the same sort of traps that probably others have fallen into in the past.
Sounds good to me, Ali, yes, because obviously they all follow the same trend. The ESPs follow the same trend throughout, so that would be good. Anna's just said, is there any, we really need training for exams officers and training on entries. So that wouldn't necessarily be myself and Ali, but we can speak to the quality team because they will have support and guidance for you to ensure you can upload evidence, etc. To our walled garden platform. So yes, we will also mention that back to our technicals quality team as well. Final point from Sally Ann Dixon, teaching resources. There are teaching resources currently available for free for the core. So outcomes 1 to 7 that Ali went through previously. There are teaching resources, there are schemes of work, presentations, worksheets, and formative assessments as well for the all the core. So you can access those on our website under tutor resources. What we'll do now is we'll wrap it up. I will take a copy of all the frequently asked questions and answer them accordingly and put a frequently asked questions document up onto our website so you can review them in your own time. Many thanks indeed for joining us today. Apologies that we have run over, but we're hoping that you found it worthwhile. Watch out for our next webinars. They can be registered for on our events and webinar page under the T-level drop-down menu on the City and Guilds website. So from myself and Ali, many thanks, and we hope it's been of use. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.